The rope cut into her skin long before anyone heard her scream. Maggie Doyle hung from an old cottonwood tree at the edge of the Kansas plain. Her bare feet swung inches above the burned yellow grass. Her body twisted weakly under the summer sun. The heat pressed down on her chest until every breath felt stolen. She was 26 years old. She had been married once to a good man named Thomas. He died in a fever 2 winters ago, left her alone with a ranch and a brother-in-law who smelled opportunity in her grief. The rope was tied wrong, too tight, wrapped around her waist and between her legs in a way that made every movement agony. The coarse fibers dug into places that made her want to die from shame alone. Her hands were bound behind her back. Her throat was raw from screaming. No one had come. No one would come. Wade had made sure of that. He had brought her out here at dawn when the ranch hands were still sleeping, when the road was empty, when the world was not watching. Was not. She tried not to cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying only made men like Wade crueler. He fed on tears the way some men fed on whiskey. The more she wept, the more he smiled. But the pain was too much. The rope shifted again. Something tore inside her. Not skin, but something deeper. The last piece of pride she had been holding on to. "Please," she whispered. Her voice cracked like dry wood. "It is rubbing against me. Please make it stop." No one answered. The wind blew hot across the plain. The grass rustled. A hawk circled overhead, patient and indifferent. Maggie closed her eyes and prayed for death. 3 miles away, a man named Caleb Hart was riding fence along the Cimarron River. He was 48 years old, weathered by dust and loss. His face was lined from years of squinting into the Kansas sun. His hands were rough from decades of honest work. His wife Sarah had died 3 winters ago. Consumption took her slow. He had watched her fade like autumn leaves, beautiful and brittle until the end. After she was gone, he stopped going to church, stopped going to town, stopped doing anything except working his ranch and waiting for his own time to come. He heard a sound that stopped his horse cold. It was not a shout. It was not a call for help. It was something worse. A voice so broken it barely qualified as human. Someone begging through pain they could not name out loud. Caleb turned his horse toward the sound. He moved slow at first, then faster as the voice grew clearer. His hand found the old Colt on his hip. Not because he expected trouble, because trouble had a way of finding honest men whether they expected it or not. He crested a small rise and saw the cottonwood tree. And then he saw her, a young woman, hanging, bruised, barely conscious. The rope wrapped around her body in ways that made his stomach turn. Her dress was torn. Her feet were bare and bloody. Her face was swollen from crying. Caleb did not hesitate. He did not look away. He did not ask questions. He pulled his knife and cut the rope in one clean motion, caught her before she hit the ground, lowered her gently into the shade. She collapsed against his chest, shaking so hard her teeth clicked together, her whole body trembling like a newborn calf in a snowstorm. "I am sorry," she whispered. The words came automatic, reflexive. The apology of someone who had been taught that everything was always her fault. Caleb shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. He turned his body to block her from the open plain, to give her what little privacy he could. "Do not move," he said. His voice was low and steady. "You are safe now." She looked up at him. Her eyes were hollow, empty, the eyes of someone who had stopped believing in words like safe a long time ago. "Who did this to you?" he asked. She swallowed hard. Her throat was so raw she could barely speak. "My brother-in-law," she said. "His name is Wade Doyle." Caleb nodded once. He did not ask why. He did not ask what she had done to deserve it. He had seen enough cruelty in his life to know that victims rarely deserve what happened to them. The question was never what did she do. The question was always what kind of monster would do this to another human being. "Can you ride?" he asked. Maggie nodded. "Barely. Then we are leaving. Right now, before he comes back." He helped her onto his horse, climbed up behind her, held her steady with one arm while he guided the reins with the other. The sun was starting its long descent toward the horizon. The shadows were getting longer, and somewhere between this tree and the town of Dodge City, a lie was already being born. Wade Doyle would not let this go. He would come looking for her. He would tell stories. He would twist the truth until right looked wrong and wrong looked right. But that was a problem for later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting this woman somewhere safe. Somewhere Wade could not reach her. Somewhere she could start to heal. Caleb kicked his horse into a gallop and headed for home. Caleb did not take her straight into town. He knew better than that. Dodge City was a place where gossip traveled faster than truth. A young widow alone with an older widower. Bruised, barely dressed, her clothes torn in ways that suggested things no decent person would say out loud. The town would have her tried and convicted before she ever opened her mouth to explain. So Caleb guided his horse along the creek line instead, away from the main road, away from prying eyes, toward the far edge of his ranch where an old barn stood crooked against the Kansas sky. Maggie drifted in and out of consciousness the whole way. Every jolt of the horse made her whimper. Every bump in the trail made her grip his arm tighter. By the time they reached the barn, her face was gray with pain. Caleb carried her inside, set her down on a pile of clean hay, closed the barn door halfway to block the wind and any wandering eyes. "I'm going to get some water," he said. "Do not try to move." He went to the well and drew a bucket, grabbed some clean rags from the tack room, found the jar of salve his wife Sarah had taught him to make. Tallow and herbs, good for burns, good for wounds that needed time more than stitches. When he came back, Maggie was sitting up, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes fixed on the door like she expected a monster to walk through at any moment. "He is not here," Caleb said. "You are safe." She did not answer. Safe was not a word she believed in anymore. Caleb knelt beside her. He kept his movements slow, deliberate. The way you approached a frightened horse, no sudden moves, no loud noises, just patience and calm. "I need to look at your injuries," he said. "Is that all right?" Maggie nodded, her cheeks flushed with shame, but she nodded. Caleb cleaned the rope burns on her arms first, then her ankles, then the places on her torso where the rope had dug deepest. He worked careful, professional, like a man who had doctored hundreds of injured animals and knew that the touch mattered as much as the medicine. When he reached the worst of the damage, the places where the rope had rubbed between her legs, he stopped. "This needs attention," he said. "But I can get a woman from town if you prefer. Someone who might be more comfortable for you." Maggie shook her head. "No," she said. "No women from town. They will talk. They will tell everyone. They will make it worse." Caleb understood. He had lived in Dodge City long enough to know how cruel compassion could be when it came wrapped in gossip. "All right," he said. "I will be as gentle as I can." He cleaned the wounds with warm water, applied the salve with careful fingers, wrapped clean bandages around the worst of the abrasions. The whole time Maggie stared at the wall, her jaw clenched, her hands balled into fists. When he finished, he pulled a blanket over her shoulders and sat back. "It will heal," he said, "but it will take time." That word again, time. As if time fixed anything. As if the hours and days and weeks ahead would erase what Wade had done to her body and her soul. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Her voice was small, confused, like a child who had forgotten what kindness looked like. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Because someone should have helped you a long time ago," he said, "and no one did." Maggie felt something crack inside her chest, not bone, not muscle, something deeper. A wall she had built around her heart to keep from feeling anything at all. She started to cry, not the quiet tears she had taught herself to hide. Real crying, the ugly kind. The kind that shook her whole body and made sounds she did not recognize as her own. Caleb did not try to stop her, did not tell her to hush or calm down or be strong. He just sat there, quiet and steady, a witness to her grief. When the tears finally stopped, Maggie felt empty, hollowed out, but also lighter somehow, like she had been carrying a weight she did not know she was holding. "I am sorry," she said. "Force of habit." Caleb shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. "Nothing at all." Outside, the sun was setting. The sky turned orange and pink and purple. Through the cracks in the barn walls, Maggie could see the first stars coming out. She was still in danger. She knew that. Wade would come looking for her. He would not stop until he found her, until he punished her for running, until he broke her completely. But for now, for this one moment, she was not alone, and that was enough. Caleb stood and walked to the door. "I'm going to check on the horses," he said. "Try to get some sleep. We have a lot to figure out tomorrow." He paused at the door, looked back at her. You are stronger than you know, he said. Remember that. Then he was gone, and Maggie was alone with the hay in the shadows and the first fragile seeds of hope. Maggie did not sleep that night. She lay on the hay in Caleb's barn. She wrapped in a blanket that smelled like leather and sage, staring at the ceiling until the stars faded and the sky turned gray. Every sound made her flinch, a horse snorting, an owl hooting, the wind rattling the barn doors. She kept expecting to hear Wade's voice, that smooth, oily voice that always sounded so reasonable even when he was doing terrible things. He had a gift for making cruelty sound like concern, for making violence sound like discipline, for making her feel like everything bad that happened was somehow her own fault. He did not come. Not yet. But he would. She knew that as surely as she knew her own name. In the morning, Caleb brought her coffee and bread. Fresh baked, still warm. The smell made her realize how long it had been since she had eaten. Thank you, she said. Caleb nodded. He sat down on an overturned bucket and waited, patient as always. Tell me about him, he said finally. Wade, tell me everything. Maggie wrapped her hands around the tin cup. The warmth felt foreign. Good. She had forgotten what comfort felt like. He is my husband's brother, she said. Was my husband's brother. Thomas died 2 years ago. Fever came on fast. He was healthy 1 week and gone the next. We did not have time to say goodbye. Did not have time to make plans. Did not have time for anything. Her voice caught. Even now, after everything, Thomas's death still hurt. After the funeral, Wade came to the house. Said he was there to help. Said a widow needed protection. Said the neighbors would talk if a young woman lived alone without a man to look after her. She laughed bitterly. I believed him. I was so stupid, so trusting, so desperate for someone to tell me what to do. Caleb shook his head. You were grieving, he said. That is not stupid. That is human. Maybe, Maggie said, but I should have seen what he was. The signs were all there. The way he looked at me when he thought I was not watching. The way he touched my arm a little too long. The way he started making decisions without asking me first. She took a breath. The next part was harder. Thomas and I owned land, she said. Good land. Water rights on the Cimarron River. 160 acres of prime grazing pasture. Wade wanted it. He said that since Thomas was gone, the land should go back to the Doyle family. Said I had no legal right to keep it. Said a woman alone could not manage a ranch anyway. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. I told him no, Maggie continued. Over and over for 2 years, I told him no. I would not sign the papers. I would not give up what Thomas and I had built together. That land was all I had left of him, all I had left of the life we were supposed to have. Her hands started shaking. The coffee sloshed in the cup. That is when he started hurting me. She did not describe it. She did not need to. The marks on her body told the story well enough. At first it was small things, she said. A slap when I talked back. A shove when I did not move fast enough. He always apologized after. Always promised it would not happen again. Always made me feel like I had provoked him somehow. She looked down at her hands. Then it got worse. The slaps became punches. The shoves became kicks. He started coming to the house at night when no one could see. Started doing things that I cannot even say out loud. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Yesterday he told me I had one more chance. Sign the papers, or he would teach me a lesson I would never forget. I said no again. So he tied me to that tree, left me there, said he would come back when I was ready to behave. Caleb set down his coffee cup. His hands were steady, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. He left you there to die, he said. He left me there to break, Maggie replied. Dying would have been faster. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The morning sun slanted through the cracks in the barn walls. Dust motes floated in the golden light. Somewhere outside, a rooster crowed. Caleb stood up. His movements were slow and deliberate, the movements of a man trying very hard to control his anger. Get dressed, he said. We are going to town. Maggie's face went pale. I cannot, she said. They will talk. They will stare. They will call me things I cannot unhear. They will believe whatever Wade tells them. They always believe Wade. Caleb looked at her. His eyes were steady. calm, certain. They will talk whether you go or not, he said. The only difference is whether you let them tell your story or you tell it yourself. Maggie stared at him. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever given her a choice. Before she could answer, the sound of hooves came from the road. Lots of them, moving fast. Caleb was at the door in 3 steps, his hand on his gun. Stay here, he said. Do not come out until I tell you. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Maggie pressed her eye to a crack between the boards. What she saw made her blood run cold. Wade Doyle sat on a black horse at the edge of Caleb's property. Behind him were 6 men, ranch hands, hired muscle, men who did what they were told and did not ask questions. Wade looked exactly the same as always. Tall, broad-shouldered, handsome in that easy way that made women trust him and men follow him. He wore a clean white shirt and a black vest. His boots were polished. His smile was well-edited and friendly and completely false. "Morning, Hart," Wade said. His voice carried across the yard, loud enough for anyone passing to hear. "I hear you picked up something that does not belong to you." Caleb stood on the porch, his feet planted, his arms loose at his sides. "She is resting," he said. Wade laughed. It was a pleasant sound if you did not know him. A social laugh, a charming laugh, the laugh of a man who had never been told no in his life. "Town is already talking," Wade said. "Folks heard all kinds of interesting things. A young widow, an old widower, alone all night in a barn. People are filling in the blanks, Hart, the way they always do." He shook his head with mock sadness. "You know how it looks," he said. "Even if nothing happened, even if you are innocent as a lamb, the damage is already done. Her reputation is ruined, and so is yours." Caleb did not move. "Say her name again," he said. "See what happens." Wade raised his hands in that calming gesture Maggie knew so well, the gesture that always came before the violence. "Easy now," he said. "I am just here to take my sister-in-law home. She is confused, been listening to lies. Family takes care of family. You understand that, do you not?" The barn door opened. Maggie stepped out. Her legs were shaking. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. But her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said. Wade's smile flickered for just a moment, just long enough for Maggie to see the monster underneath. "Maggie, darling," he said. His voice dripped with false concern. "You are not well. You are not thinking clearly. Let me take you home, and we can sort all this out." "I am never going back to that house," Maggie said, "and I am never signing those papers. Not today, not ever." Wade's smile disappeared completely. "You do not have a choice," he said. "That land belongs to the Doyle family. You are just a temporary inconvenience." Caleb stepped forward. One step, then another. His hand still rested near his gun. "She is not yours," he said. "She never was, and she is staying here." The 2 men stared at each other. The air between them crackled with tension. Wade's men shifted nervously on their horses. They had expected this to be easy. A quick trip, a scared woman. No resistance. They had not expected Caleb Hart. Wade moved first. He swung down from his horse and walked toward the porch. His boots crunched on the gravel. His hands hung loose at his sides. "Let me tell you something, Hart," he said. "This town belongs to me. The sheriff works for me. The banker owes me money. The mayor plays cards at my table every Saturday night. You think you can protect her. You think you can fight me. But you are just one man, and I have an army." He stopped 3 feet from Caleb. "Close enough to touch. Walk away," Wade said. "Walk away, and I will forget this ever happened. Keep her, and I will destroy you both." Caleb did not blink. "Then I guess you better start destroying," he said. Wade shoved him, hard, both hands on Caleb's chest. Caleb stumbled back 1 step. Just one. Then he came back swinging. The punch landed clean. Right on Wade's jaw. The sound echoed across the yard like a gunshot. Wade hit the dirt. His men reached for their guns. Caleb's Colt cleared leather before any of them could draw. "Easy," Caleb said, "real easy. Any man draws on me, I drop him where he sits." Nobody moved. Wade wiped blood from his lip. He was still on the ground, still staring up at Caleb with those cold eyes. This is not over, he said. Then neither am I, Caleb replied. Wade climbed to his feet, slow, deliberate. He dusted off his vest, straightened his collar, every movement calculated to show that he was not afraid. Town has already chosen what it believes, he said. You think you are saving her, but all you are doing is making it worse. When the shame gets too heavy, when the whispers get too loud, when she realizes that no decent man will ever look at her again, she will come crawling back to me. He mounted his horse. See you around, Hart. They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving silence behind. Caleb holstered his gun and turned to Maggie. She was still standing in the doorway of the barn. Her face was white. Her hands were pressed against her stomach like she was trying to hold herself together. Are you all right? He asked. She nodded, but her eyes told a different story. He will not stop, she said. He never stops. He always gets what he wants. Caleb walked over to her. He did not touch her, did not crowd her, just stood close enough that she could feel his presence. Then we will not stop either, he said. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we fight. Maggie looked up at him. This man she barely knew, this stranger who had already risked more for her than anyone else in her life. Why, she asked. Why do you care what happens to me? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Because I know what it feels like to be alone, he said, and I would not wish that on anyone. Maggie felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening that she thought she had locked forever. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt like she might not be alone after all. Caleb did not sleep much that night. After Wade rode off, the ranch went quiet in that uneasy way that comes before a storm. The kind of quiet that makes you jump at shadows and reach for your gun when a branch cracks in the wind. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the road, waiting. Maggie tried to sleep in the barn, but could not. Around midnight, she gave up and came to sit beside him on the porch. She wrapped herself in a blanket and stared out at the darkness without speaking. They stayed like that until dawn, two people keeping watch. Two people who had learned the hard way that the world was not safe for people like them. When the sun came up, Caleb saddled his horse. I'm going into town, he said. There is someone I need to see. Who? Maggie asked. A man named Amos Reed, Caleb said. Justice of the peace. If Wade wants to play this through the law, we need to get there first. Maggie shook her head. Her voice was bitter. The law does not help women like me, she said. The law belongs to men like Wade. Caleb tightened the saddle straps with more force than necessary. Then we will make it help you, he said. One way or another, he rode into Dodge City with dust on his boots and purpose in his eyes. The town was just waking up. Shopkeepers were opening their doors. Farmers were heading to the general store. Women were sweeping their porches and pretending not to watch every stranger who passed. Caleb felt their eyes on him. He knew what they were thinking. By now, the whole town had heard some version of the story. A young widow found at his ranch, half-dressed, in his barn, alone with him all night. He ignored the stairs and headed straight for the little office beside the jail, the one with the crooked sign that said Justice of the Peace in faded letters. Inside, an old man looked up from a stack of papers. He had white hair and spectacles and the kind of face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Caleb Hart, the old man said. You are either early or late, depends who is telling the story. He gestured to a rickety chair. Name is Amos Reed. Sit down before you fall down. You look like you have not slept in days. Caleb sat. The chair creaked under his weight. I need your help, he said. Amos leaned back and folded his hands over his belly. I figured as much. Whole town is buzzing about that girl you found. Wade Doyle has been telling anyone who will listen that you stole his brother's widow and ruined her honor. He raised an eyebrow. That the truth? No, Caleb said. The truth is Wade tied her to a tree and left her there to die. The truth is he has been beating her for 2 years trying to steal her land. The truth is she is scared for her life and has no one else to turn to. Amos studied him for a long moment. His eyes were sharp despite his age. Measuring, weighing. That is a serious accusation, he said finally. You have any proof? I have her word, Caleb said, and I have the marks on her body that match every word she says. Amos nodded slowly. Bring her in, he said. I will take her statement. Put it on record. That way, if anything happens to her, there is a paper trail. He leaned forward. But I have to warn you, Hart, Wade Doyle has a lot of friends in this town. Important friends. The kind that can make problems disappear. Going up against him will not be easy. I am not looking for easy, Caleb said. I am looking for right. Amos almost smiled. Been a long time since I heard someone say that and mean it. Caleb thanked him and left the office. He had business at the general store. Supplies to buy. Medicine for Maggie's wounds. Food for the days ahead. But when he stepped outside, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Wade Doyle was standing across the street, leaning against a post outside the hotel, watching him with that easy smile that never reached his eyes. And beside him was a stranger, clean-dressed, polished boots, a leather satchel tucked under his arm, the kind of man who made his living with paper and ink instead of muscle and sweat. A lawyer, or worse, a land agent. Wade saw Caleb looking. He lifted his chin in acknowledgement, did not wave, did not speak, just made sure Caleb saw who he was standing with. Then Wade turned and walked into the hotel. The stranger followed. Caleb's stomach dropped. He knew what this was. He had seen it before. Men like Wade did not fight fair. They did not come at you head on. They came at you sideways, through lawyers and deeds and signatures that appeared out of nowhere. Wade was not just trying to scare Maggie into signing. He was going to steal her land out from under her. Caleb ran back to Amos Reed's office, burst through the door so hard it slammed against the wall. "We have a problem," he said. Amos looked up from his papers. Already? Wade is at the hotel with a paper man. They are up to something that involves documents and signatures. Amos's face went pale. "Land deed," he said, "has to be. If Wade can produce a signed deed transferring the property to him, it does not matter what the girl says. Possession is 9/10 of the law out here. Can he do that? Can he forge her signature?" Amos stood up, grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. "He can try," he said. "Whether he succeeds depends on how fast we can get there." They hurried across the street to the hotel. Caleb's hand rested on his gun. No, not threatening, just ready. The hotel lobby was empty except for a clerk behind the desk. He looked up nervously when they entered. "Wade Doyle," Caleb said. "Where is he?" The clerk swallowed hard. "Back office," he said, "with Mr. Pemberton, the land agent from Wichita." Caleb pushed past him and headed for the back room. Amos followed close behind. They found Wade sitting at a desk, a document spread out before him. Ink still wet. The land agent stood beside him with a satisfied smile. "Too late, Hart," Wade said. He held up the paper. "Water rights, parcel boundaries, all signed and witnessed, all perfectly legal." Caleb looked at the document. At the bottom in shaky handwriting was a signature. Margaret Ann Doyle. "That is a forgery," he said. Wade laughed. "Prove it." The room went quiet. Caleb could feel his heart pounding in his chest, could feel the anger building like steam in a kettle. Amos stepped forward. His voice was calm and steady. "I have known Margaret Doyle for 3 years," he said. "I witnessed her signature on half a dozen documents when she and Thomas were buying that land. And I can tell you right now that signature is not hers." Wade's smile flickered. "That is just your opinion," he said. "And last I checked, your opinion does not count for much in this town." "Maybe not," Amos said, "but the law does. And I intend to file a formal challenge to this deed first thing tomorrow morning, unless you want to withdraw it voluntarily." Wade stood up slowly. He was still smiling, but the warmth was gone from his eyes. What remained was cold, hard, dangerous. "You are making a mistake, Amos," he said. "A big mistake. I have friends on the town council, friends in the territorial government, friends who can make your life very difficult." "Then I guess I will have to make new friends," Amos said. He turned and walked out of the office. Caleb followed. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky was painted red and orange, beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel given what had just happened. "What now?" Caleb asked. "Now we wait," Amos said. "I file my challenge in the morning. We bring the girl in to give her statement. We let the law do its job." He looked at Caleb with tired eyes. "And we pray that the law is stronger than Wade's friends." Caleb rode back to the ranch as fast as his horse could carry him. He found Maggie waiting on the porch. Her face was pale, her hands were shaking. "What happened?" she asked. Caleb told her. About Wade, about the forged deed, about Amos Reed and the challenge he planned to file. When he finished, Maggie was quiet for a long time. "He will not give up," she said finally. "He never gives up. He will keep coming and coming until he gets what he wants or until one of us is dead." Caleb sat down beside her. "Then we will keep fighting," he said, "until he runs out of tricks, until the law catches up with him, until the whole town sees him for what he really is." Maggie looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Why do you believe me?" she asked. "You do not know me. You have no reason to trust me. For all you know, everything Wade says is true." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I believe you because I have seen the marks on your body," he said. "I believe you because I saw your face when you talked about what he did. I believe you because lies have a smell to them, and you do not smell like a liar." He met her eyes. "And I believe you because my wife taught me to trust my gut, and my gut says you are telling the truth." Maggie felt something crack inside her chest, a wall she had built to protect herself from ever trusting anyone again. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb nodded. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looked out at the darkness gathering over the Kansas plain. Somewhere out there, Wade Doyle was planning his next move. And Caleb had a feeling it was going to be worse than anything they had seen so far. 3 days passed without incident. On the surface, nothing seemed to change. The sun rose, the sun set, the cattle grazed, the wind blew across the plain like it had for 1,000 years before and would for 1,000 years after. But underneath the calm, something was building, something dark, something patient. Maggie started to breathe again, started to sleep through the night without waking up screaming, started to eat full meals and take walks around the ranch and even smile once or twice when Caleb said something funny. He was a good man. She could see that now. Not just because of what he had done for her, but because of who he was. The way he treated his horses, the way he spoke to his ranch hands, the way he said grace before every meal, even though he had admitted he was not sure he believed in God anymore. He had lost his wife 3 years ago, Sarah. He did not talk about her much, but when he did, his voice changed, softened, became something tender and fragile that he tried very hard to hide. Maggie understood that kind of grief. She carried the same weight herself. On the fourth day, a rider came to the ranch. Maggie was helping Caleb mend a fence when she saw the dust cloud on the road. Her whole body went stiff. Her hands started to shake. "Easy," Caleb said. "It is probably just Amos with news about the challenge." But it was not Amos. It was a young man in a clean suit, official looking. He rode up to the porch and dismounted without smiling. "I am looking for Margaret Ann Doyle," he said. Maggie stepped forward. Her heart was pounding. "That is me." The young man handed her an envelope. "You have been summoned to appear before the town council," he said. 3 days from now, 10 o'clock in the morning. The charge is fraud." He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. Maggie stared at the envelope. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed, official, cold. She read it 3 times before the words sank in. Wade had flipped the whole thing around. He was not defending himself against her accusations. He was accusing her. "Fraud," she said. The word came out hollow, disbelieving. "He is saying I forged the deed, that I tried to steal his family's property." Caleb took the paper from her. "Read it slowly." His face darkened with every line. "This is his game," he said. "He knows his forgery will not hold up to scrutiny, so he is putting you on trial instead, making you prove your innocence instead of proving his. Can he do that?" "In Dodge City," Caleb said grimly. "Wade can do just about anything." They rode into town the next morning. Amos Reed was waiting at his office. His face was grim. "I heard," he said. "Wade filed the complaint himself. Signed affidavits from 3 witnesses who claim they saw you signing that deed willingly. Claim you were laughing and chatting like old friends." "That is a lie," Maggie said. "Every word of it." "I know," Amos said, "but lies are easy to tell. Proving them wrong is harder." He sat down heavily behind his desk. Suddenly, he looked very old. "You have 2 choices," he said. "You can run, leave town, start over somewhere else. Wade gets the land and you get your freedom. It is not fair, but it is safe. Or, Maggie said, or you can fight. Go before the council. Tell your story. Hope they believe you over 3 men who will say anything Wade tells them to say. Maggie looked at Caleb. He was standing by the window, staring out at the street. What do you think, she asked. Caleb turned. His eyes met hers. I think you have been running your whole life, he said. I think Wade has been counting on that. Counting on you being too scared, too tired, too broken to stand up for yourself. He walked over to her, stood close but did not touch her. I also think you are stronger than you know. Stronger than Wade gives you credit for. And I think if you run now, you will be running forever. Maggie swallowed hard. What if I fight and lose? Then at least you will know you tried, Caleb said. And so will I. Maggie closed her eyes. She thought about Thomas, about the life they had planned together, about the ranch they had built with their own hands, about the promises they had made each other on their wedding day. I will never leave you, Thomas had said. No matter what happens, I will always be here. But he was not here. He was gone, buried in the little cemetery at the edge of town. And Maggie was alone. Except she was not alone, not anymore. She opened her eyes and looked at Caleb. I will fight, she said. Caleb almost smiled. Good, he said. Then we better get you ready. That night, Maggie did not sleep in the barn. Caleb gave her the guest room in the main house, the room that had belonged to Sarah once, that had not been used since she died. The bed was soft, the sheets were clean, the curtains were white and let in the moonlight. Maggie lay in the darkness and stared at the ceiling. She thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The good times with Thomas, the bad times with Wade, the stranger who had cut her down from a tree and given her back her life. Tomorrow she would ride into Dodge City. Tomorrow she would face the council. Tomorrow she would tell her story to men who might not believe her. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, she felt something other than fear. She felt ready. In the morning, Caleb was waiting on the porch with 2 horses saddled and ready. Maggie stepped outside. She was wearing a blue cotton dress that Caleb had found in an old trunk. Sarah's dress, simple and clean and dignified. You look like you are going to war, Caleb said. Maybe I am, Maggie replied. They rode together down the long road to Dodge City. The sun was just coming up. The sky was painted gold and pink. Ahead of them, the town waited with its gossip and its judgment and its hungry eyes. But for the first time, Maggie was not afraid of what she would find there. She was ready to face it. Whatever happened next, she would face it on her own terms. Dodge City looked different in the morning light. Maggie had lived near this town for 3 years. She had walked its streets 100 times, bought supplies at its stores, nodded to its people, attended its church on Sunday mornings. But today, riding in beside Caleb, the familiar streets felt like foreign territory. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned, eyes followed. Maggie could feel their judgment like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She could hear the whispers starting before she even passed. That is her. The Doyle widow, the one they found at Hart's place. I heard she was half naked when he found her. I heard she was more than half. Maggie kept her back straight, her chin up, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Caleb rode close beside her, their horses nearly touching. A silent message to everyone watching. She was not alone. She had someone willing to stand beside her. They tied their horses outside Amos Reed's office. The deputy, Tom Sullivan, was waiting on the porch. He was young, maybe 25, with honest eyes and a nervous habit of adjusting his hat. Ma'am, he said. Mr. Hart, is Amos inside? Caleb asked. Tom nodded. Been here since dawn. Said you would be coming. They went inside. The office was cramped and dusty, overflowing with papers and books and the smell of old coffee. Amos sat behind his desk, looking like he had not slept in days. Mrs. Doyle, he said, thank you for coming. Maggie nodded. She did not trust her voice. Amos gestured to a chair. Please sit down. We have a lot to discuss before tomorrow. Tomorrow. The council meeting, the trial, the moment when everything would be decided one way or another. I need you to tell me your story, Amos said. From the beginning. Everything you can remember. The more details you can give me, the better chance we have. Maggie took a deep breath, and then she started talking. She told him about Thomas, how they had met at a barn dance 5 years ago, how he had asked her to dance 3 times before she finally said yes, how he had proposed under a full moon with wildflowers in his hands and hope in his eyes. She told him about their wedding, small and simple, just them and a preacher and the endless Kansas sky. She told him about the ranch, how they had built it together from nothing, how Thomas had worked from dawn to dusk to make the land produce, how they had dreamed of filling the house with children someday. She told him about Thomas's death, the fever that came on so fast, the way he had held her hand at the end and made her promise to be strong. And she told him about Wade, about how he had shown up at the funeral with that sympathetic smile, about how he had started coming around more and more often, about how his concern had slowly turned to control and his kindness had turned to cruelty. She told him about the first time Wade hit her, a slap across the face because she had questioned something he said, the shock of it, the disbelief, the way he had apologized after and made her feel like it was somehow her fault. She told him about the papers, the deed he wanted her to sign, her refusals, his growing anger. And she told him about the tree. When she finished, the room was silent. Even the sounds from the street outside seemed muted, distant. Amos leaned back in his chair. His face was unreadable. "I need you to sign a statement," he said. "Your real signature, so we can compare it to the one on Wade's forged deed." Maggie nodded. She took the pen he offered. Her hand was trembling, but her name came out clear and strong. Margaret Ann Doyle. Amos studied the signature carefully. Then he pulled out the copy of Wade's deed and laid them side by side. "Not even close," he said. "His forgery is too smooth, too practiced. Your real signature has character, natural variation, the imperfection that comes from actually being the person who wrote it." "So you can prove it is a forgery?" Caleb asked. "I can prove it was not her hand that signed it," Amos said. "Whether the council will accept that proof is another matter." He looked at Maggie with troubled eyes. "Wade has powerful friends on that council, men who owe him money, men who benefit from his goodwill, men who will not want to believe that one of their own is capable of what he has done." "What are we up against?" Caleb asked. 5 council members," Amos said. "The mayor, the banker, the railroad agent, the cattle baron, and the preacher." He ticked them off on his fingers. "The mayor owes Wade money from a bad land deal 3 years ago. The banker handles all of Wade's accounts and takes a healthy commission. The railroad agent is trying to buy land that Wade controls access to." "And the others?" Maggie asked. "The cattle baron is Wade's cousin by marriage, so that leaves the preacher. Reverend Whitmore. He is the only one I trust to judge this case fairly." "One man," Caleb said. "We are counting on one honest man." Amos nodded grimly. "That is about the size of it." They spent the rest of the morning preparing, going over details, practicing answers to questions that might be asked, preparing for the tricks and traps that Wade's lawyer would certainly try to spring. By noon, Maggie was exhausted, wrung out, but also strangely calm. Whatever happened tomorrow, she had done everything she could. The rest was out of her hands. They left Amos's office and stepped out into the afternoon sun. The street was busier now. More people, more eyes. A woman walked past and deliberately turned her face away. A man tipped his hat but did not smile. A group of children stopped their game to stare. Caleb guided Maggie toward the general store. "We need supplies," he said. "Might as well get them while we are here." Inside the store, a woman named Mrs. Henderson looked up from the counter. She was small and gray-haired with kind eyes that had seen too much. "Mr. Hart," she said. "Mrs. Doyle." She said Maggie's name carefully, like she was not quite sure how to feel about it. "Just some flour and coffee," Caleb said, "and whatever salve you have for healing wounds." Mrs. Henderson gathered the items. As she wrapped them, she leaned closer, lowered her voice. "There is talk," she said, "about what happened, about you." Maggie stiffened. "What kind of talk?" Mrs. Henderson glanced at the door, then back at them. "Some folks are saying you brought this on yourself, that you were carrying on with someone, that Wade was just trying to protect the family honor." She shook her head. "But I knew Thomas. He was a good man, and I have seen how Wade looks at women when he thinks no one is watching." She pushed the wrapped packages across the counter. Not everyone believes the lies, she said. Some of us remember the truth. Maggie felt her eyes sting. Thank you, she whispered. They left the store and walked back toward their horses. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. The shadows were getting long. As they mounted up, a voice called from across the street. Running away already? Maggie's blood went cold. Wade stepped out of the saloon. He was smiling. That same cruel smile she had seen 1,000 times before. I heard you were in town, Wade said, making accusations, telling lies, trying to turn people against your own family. Caleb's hand moved toward his gun. Walk away, Doyle, Wade laughed. Or what? You will shoot me in broad daylight? In front of all these witnesses? He gestured to the people watching from windows and doorways. They already know what kind of woman she is. They already know what happened at your ranch, an old widower, a young widow, alone together night after night. People can do the math. Maggie felt the shame rising in her chest, the old familiar shame that Wade knew exactly how to trigger. But then something unexpected happened. An old woman stepped out of the dress shop across the street. She was gray-haired and stern-faced. Her name was Mrs. Callahan, and she had lived in Dodge City longer than almost anyone. Wade Doyle, she said. Her voice was sharp as a knife. I have known you since you were a boy stealing apples from my tree, and I have never seen a meaner or more worthless excuse for a man. Wade's smile flickered. Mrs. Callahan, this does not concern you. It concerns everyone, she said. When a man treats a woman the way you treated her, when he lies and steals and calls it family business, that concerns the whole town. She walked forward and stood between Wade and Maggie. I believe her, Mrs. Callahan said, and I am not the only one. Behind her, other people started to emerge. Mrs. Henderson from the store, a blacksmith named John, a young woman from the church. Not a crowd, not yet, but enough. Wade looked at them. His smile was gone now. What remained was something cold and hard and dangerous. This is not over, he said. Then he turned and walked back into the saloon. Maggie sat on her horse, trembling, but not from fear this time, from hope. Mrs. Callahan reached up and took her hand. You come back tomorrow, she said. You tell your truth, and we will be there to hear it. Maggie nodded. She could not speak. There were too many feelings trying to get out at once. Caleb tipped his hat to the old woman. Thank you, ma'am. Just doing what is right, Mrs. Callahan said. Same as you. They rode out of town as the sun set behind them. The road stretched ahead, long and dusty and uncertain. But for the first time, Maggie felt like she might not be alone in this fight. She had never been alone. She just had not known where to look. The morning of the trial dawned gray and cold. Maggie dressed in Sarah's blue dress. She brushed her hair until it shone. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. 2 weeks ago, she had been hanging from a tree, praying for death. Now she was about to fight for her life. Caleb was waiting on the porch when she came outside. He was wearing his best shirt and his cleanest boots. His hat was brushed. His gun belt was polished. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. You are ready, he said finally. It was not a question. Maggie nodded. I am ready. They rode into town together. The streets were busier than usual. Word had spread about the hearing. People had come from miles around to watch. The trial was being held in the back room of the Dodge House Hotel. It was the biggest space in town, normally used for dances and town meetings and the occasional theatrical performance. Today it had been transformed into a courtroom. Rows of chairs faced a long table where the 5 council members sat. Behind them, an American flag hung on the wall. To the side, a smaller table was set up for witnesses. The room was already packed when Maggie and Caleb arrived. People filled every chair and lined the walls 3 deep. The air was thick with whispers and the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. Maggie saw Mrs. Callahan in the front row, Mrs. Henderson beside her. A handful of other faces she recognized, people who had nodded at her in the street, people who might believe her story. She also saw Wade. He sat at a table on the opposite side of the room, clean-shaven, well-dressed, looking every inch the respectable citizen. Beside him was a lawyer from Wichita, a thin man with spectacles and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The mayor banged his gavel on the table. This hearing will come to order, he said. We are here to determine the rightful ownership of the Thomas Doyle property on the Cimarron River. He looked at Wade. Mr. Doyle, you may present your case. Wade stood, he buttoned his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, every movement calm and controlled. Thank you, Mayor, he said. His voice was smooth as honey. This is a simple matter. My brother Thomas, God rest his soul, died without a proper will. Under the laws of Kansas, his property should pass to his closest male relative. That would be me. He picked up a document from the table. I have here a deed of transfer, he said, signed by Margaret Doyle herself, witnessed by 3 upstanding citizens of this community. The document clearly shows that she agreed to transfer the property to me in exchange for my continued protection and support. He shook his head sadly. Unfortunately, my sister-in-law has had a change of heart, perhaps influenced by certain individuals who have their own reasons for wanting to see me fail. He glanced at Caleb. She is now claiming that the deed is a forgery, that I forced her to sign against her will. These accusations are hurtful and untrue. He sat down. The mayor nodded. Mr. Reed, you may present the defense. Amos stood slowly. He walked to the front of the room with the unhurried pace of a man who had all the time in the world. Gentlemen, he said, I have been a justice of the peace in this town for 23 years. In that time, I have seen many documents cross my desk, and I have learned to recognize the difference between a genuine signature and a forgery. He held up 2 pieces of paper. This is the deed Mr. Doyle filed with the county clerk, he said, and this is a signature Mrs. Doyle wrote in my office yesterday in front of witnesses. He laid them side by side on the table in front of the council. Look at them closely, he said. The signature on the deed is smooth, perfect, the kind of signature a forger makes when he is concentrating too hard. Mrs. Doyle's real signature has natural variation, slight imperfections, the authentic mark of a real person. The council members leaned forward, studied the papers. That is just your opinion, Wade's lawyer said. Handwriting analysis is hardly an exact science. Perhaps, Amos agreed, but I also have this. He produced another document. This is a land deed that Thomas and Margaret Doyle filed 3 years ago when they purchased the property, witnessed by myself and 2 other parties. Notice the signature. He pointed. Margaret Ann Doyle, written in the same hand, with the same natural characteristics, the same slight imperfections. He looked at Wade. Your forgery was skillful, Mr. Doyle, but not skillful enough. Wade's smile never wavered. This is all speculation, he said. The fact remains that I have 3 witnesses who saw her sign that document willingly. Then let us hear from them, Amos said. Wade called his witnesses one by one. 3 men who worked on his ranch. They all told the same story, that they had seen Maggie sign the deed in Wade's office, that she had seemed calm and willing, that she had thanked Wade for taking care of her. It was lies, every word of it, but they told the lies well. When they finished, Amos stood again. I would like to call Margaret Doyle to the stand, he said. Maggie rose. Her legs felt weak. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She walked to the front of the room, sat in the witness chair, faced the council. Tell us what happened, Amos said gently, in your own words. Maggie took a breath, and then she told them everything. She told them about Thomas, about their marriage, about his death, about the grief that had nearly swallowed her whole. She told them about Wade, about how his concern had turned to control, about the first time he hit her, about the pattern of violence that had escalated over 2 years. She told them about the papers he wanted her to sign, about her refusals, about his growing anger, and she told them about the tree. When she described the rope, her voice broke, but she did not stop. He tied me there to break me, she said, to make me so ashamed that I would sign anything just to make it stop. He wanted me to give up, to let him have everything. She looked at Wade. He was still smiling, but his eyes were cold. But I am not broken, she said, and I am not giving up. The room was silent. Then Wade's lawyer stood. Mrs. Doyle, he said, is it true that you were found at Mr. Hart's ranch in a state of undress? Maggie felt her face flush. I was injured, she said. Mr. Hart was treating my wounds. The lawyer smiled. And you spent multiple nights alone with him at his ranch? I was recovering, Maggie said. I had nowhere else to go. Nowhere else, the lawyer repeated. You have no friends in this town? No other family? No one except a man old enough to be your father who just happened to find you alone and vulnerable?" Maggie's hands were shaking. She could feel the crowd shifting, the whispers starting. "It was not like that," she said. "Then what was it like?" the lawyer asked. "Because from where I stand, it looks like a young widow who got tired of waiting for her husband's estate, who found a protector willing to help her steal what rightfully belongs to the Doyle family. That is enough." The voice came from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Mrs. Callahan was standing. Her old face was flushed with anger. "I have known this woman for 3 years," she said. "I have seen her work that land with her own hands. I have seen her mourn her husband like a proper wife. And I have seen Wade Doyle circling her like a vulture ever since Thomas died." Other voices joined in. Mrs. Henderson stood. "I knew Thomas Doyle," she said. "He loved his wife. He would never have wanted Wade to take her land." The blacksmith John stood. "I have seen the bruises on her arms," he said, "more than once, when she thought no one was looking." One by one, people rose, people who had been silent before, people who had looked the other way, people who were finally ready to speak. The mayor banged his gavel. "Order," he called, "order." But the room would not be quiet. The voices kept rising, the truth kept spreading, and Wade's face was turning red. "This is a circus," he shouted. "These people are being influenced by Hart, by this conspiracy against my family." The preacher, Reverend Whitmore, raised his hand. "If I may," he said quietly. The room fell silent. "I have listened to both sides," Reverend Whitmore said. "I have looked at the signatures. I have heard the witnesses. And I have prayed for guidance." He looked at Maggie. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "will you swear on the Bible that everything you have told us is true?" Maggie nodded. "I swear it," she said, "before God and everyone here." Reverend Whitmore nodded. "Then I have heard enough." He turned to the other council members. "I move that we reject Mr. Wade Doyle's claim to the property," he said, "and that we refer this matter to the Territorial Court for investigation of fraud and assault." The mayor shifted uncomfortably. "Surely that is premature," he said. "We should take time to consider." "Consider what?" Reverend Whitmore asked. "The evidence is clear. The signature is forged. The witnesses against Mrs. Doyle are all men who work for Wade, and a dozen citizens of this town have stood up to say they believe her." He looked around the room. "How many more do we need?" The vote was called, 3 in favor of rejecting Wade's claim, 2 against. The gavel came down. The land belonged to Maggie. Wade shot to his feet. His face was purple with rage. "This is not over," he shouted. "I will appeal. I will take this to the territorial governor. I will." Sheriff Miller stepped forward. "Mr. Doyle," he said, "I think you should come with me. We have some questions about the assault Mrs. Doyle described." Wade looked around the room, at the faces staring back at him, at the sympathy he had counted on that was no longer there. For the first time in his life, he had lost, and everyone could see it. The victory did not last. 3 days after the trial, Sheriff Miller released Wade from custody. There was not enough evidence to hold him, the sheriff said, just accusations and suspicions, nothing that would stand up in a real court of law. Maggie heard the news while she was helping Caleb mend a fence on the north pasture. A rider came out from town with a message from Amos Reed. "Wade is free. Be careful." That night, they took turns keeping watch. Caleb sat on the porch with his rifle until midnight. Then Maggie took over while he tried to sleep. She did not really expect anything to happen. Wade was smart. He would not do anything obvious so soon after being released. He would wait, plan, find some other way to hurt her. She was wrong. At 3 in the morning, she smelled smoke. At first, she thought it was a brush fire. They happen sometimes in the dry season. A spark from a campfire or a lightning strike could set the whole prairie ablaze. But this smoke was different, closer, thicker. She looked toward the barn. Fire. The flames were already climbing the walls when she screamed for Caleb, already licking at the roof, already reaching for the horses trapped inside. Caleb was on his feet in seconds. He did not ask questions, did not waste time looking for an explanation. He just ran. They got the horses out first, fighting through smoke and heat and the screaming terror of animals who knew they were about to die. Caleb's hands were burned. Maggie's dress caught fire and she had to beat it out with her bare palms. But they saved the horses. They could not save the barn. By the time dawn broke, there was nothing left but charred timbers and ash. Caleb stood in the ruins. His face was black with soot. His hands were wrapped in bandages. His eyes were empty. 30 years, he said. I built this barn 30 years ago. First thing I put up when I bought this land. Maggie stood beside him. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would help. But there were no words for this. In the ashes, Caleb found a note. It was written in block letters on paper that had somehow survived the fire. Simple, direct, unsigned. This is not over. Maggie felt her blood run cold. He crossed a line, Caleb said. His voice was flat, dangerous. Whatever game we were playing before, it is done now. This is war. They rode into town that morning, not to Amos Reed's office this time, to the sheriff. Sheriff Miller was a big man with tired eyes and a mustache that had gone gray years ago. He listened to their story, looked at the note, shook his head slowly. I cannot arrest a man based on a note, he said. Could have been anyone. Could have been an accident. We both know who did this, Caleb said. Knowing and proving are two different things, the sheriff replied. You want me to arrest Wade Doyle? I need evidence, real evidence. Something that will hold up in court. Then get it, Caleb said. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. Listen, Hart, I know Wade is trouble. I know what people say about him. But he is also connected. He has friends in this town. Friends who will not take kindly to me hauling him in on suspicion. He looked at Caleb with weary eyes. Unless you want to take matters into your own hands, in which case I would advise you to think very carefully about what you are doing. Caleb stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out without a word. Outside, Maggie caught his arm. What are we going to do? She asked. Caleb was quiet. His jaw was clenched. His eyes were hard. We are going to find proof, he said, and then we are going to make him pay for everything he has done. They spent the next week asking questions, talking to people who knew Wade, people who worked for him, people who might have seen something on the night of the fire. Most of them would not talk. They were too scared. Wade had a long reach and a longer memory. Cross him once, and you might spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. But some people did talk. A ranch hand named Billy told him he had seen Wade riding toward Caleb's property on the night of the fire. He had not thought anything of it at the time. Wade was always riding somewhere, but now that he thought about it, it did seem strange. A woman in town said she had heard Wade bragging in the saloon the next day, saying something about how Hart would learn his lesson soon enough. An old farmer said he had seen two men carrying kerosene cans along the road that night. He had not gotten a good look at their faces, but one of them was riding a black horse. The same kind of horse Wade always rode, it was not proof, not the kind that would hold up in court, but it was enough to paint a picture. Amos Reed listened to what they had found. He nodded slowly. This is good, he said, but we need more. We need someone who was there, someone who saw Wade give the order or light the match himself. Where do we find that? Maggie asked. Amos thought for a moment. Wade has a lot of men who work for him, he said. Most of them are loyal, but not all of them. Some of them are just scared. And scared men can be convinced to talk if they think the alternative is worse. He looked at Caleb. I heard one of Wade's men got fired last week. Name is Cooper. He has been drinking heavily ever since, telling anyone who will listen that Wade is crazy, that he has gone too far. He might be worth talking to. Caleb found Cooper in the worst saloon in Dodge City, a dark and dirty place where men went to forget their troubles or find new ones. Cooper was sitting alone at a corner table. He was a young man, maybe 25, but he looked older, worn down, haunted. Caleb sat down across from him. I hear you used to work for Wade Doyle. Cooper looked up. His eyes were bleary with whiskey. What of it? I hear you have some things to say about him. Cooper laughed bitterly. I have plenty to say, but saying it will get me killed. Caleb leaned forward. Wade burned down my barn 3 nights ago, nearly killed my horses, nearly killed the woman I am protecting. I need someone to testify against him, someone who knows what he is capable of. Cooper was quiet for a long time. I was there, he said finally. The night of the fire. Wade made us go, said we were going to teach you a lesson. He shook his head. I did not want to do it. But you do not say no to Wade. Not if you want to keep breathing. Will you testify? Caleb asked. In front of the council, in front of the judge. Will you tell them what you saw? Cooper stared at him. You are asking me to sign my own death warrant. I am asking you to do the right thing, Caleb said. Maybe for the first time in your life. Cooper looked down at his whiskey, at his shaking hands, at the wreck his life had become. All right, he said. I will do it. The next morning, Caleb brought Cooper to Amos Reed's office. Cooper told his story. Amos wrote it down. A deputy witnessed the signature. By noon, Sheriff Miller had a warrant for Wade Doyle's arrest. By sunset, Wade was in jail. Maggie stood outside the jail and watched them lock the door. She had waited 2 years for this moment, 2 years of pain and fear and shame. And now it was finally over, or so she thought. Wade Doyle did not go quietly. He screamed and cursed as they dragged him into the jail cell. He threatened everyone in earshot, promised revenge, promised pain, promised that they would all regret the day they turned against him. Nobody listened. The trial was held 3 weeks later, a proper trial this time, with a judge from Wichita and a jury of 12 men from the surrounding counties. Men who did not owe Wade any favors, men who had no reason to lie. Cooper testified, told the jury everything, how Wade had ordered the fire, how he had laughed while the barn burned, how he had said this was just the beginning, that Hart and that woman would pay for making him look foolish. Other witnesses came forward too, ranch hands who had seen Wade beat Maggie, townspeople who had heard him making threats. Even the men who had lied at the first hearing came back and told the truth this time. Fear could only hold them for so long. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty, on all counts. Arson, assault, fraud, conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in the territorial prison. Wade stood in the courtroom with chains on his wrists. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. No smooth words, no charming smile, just the cold reality of a man who had finally run out of luck. As the deputies led him away, he passed Maggie. Their eyes met. She saw the hatred there, the promise of revenge, the monster that had been hiding behind the mask all along. But she also saw something else, fear. Wade was finally afraid. And that was enough. That night, there was a celebration in town. People filled the streets, music played, children ran and laughed. For one evening, Dodge City felt like a place where good things could happen. Maggie stood on the porch of Caleb's house and watched the fireworks explode over the prairie. Colors painted the sky red and gold and blue. Caleb stood beside her, close but not touching. How do you feel, he asked. Maggie thought about it for a long moment. I feel like I can breathe, she said, for the first time in years. Like a weight has been lifted, she looked at him. Thank you, she said, for everything, for saving me, for believing me, for fighting beside me when you did not have to. Caleb shook his head. I just did what anyone should have done, he said, what should have been done a long time ago. Maggie smiled. Not anyone, she said. You. You did it. You. She reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had touched him by choice, not out of fear or necessity, but because she wanted to. Caleb looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face. Something shifted between them, something that had been building for weeks, unspoken, unacknowledged, but there all along. Caleb cleared his throat. It is getting late, he said. You should get some rest. Maggie nodded, but she did not let go of his hand. Stay with me, she said, just for a little while. They sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out, listening to the sounds of celebration drifting up from the town. And for the first time in a very long time, Maggie felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Peace. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the territorial prison. Wade Doyle was dead. The official cause was heart failure. But rumors spread quickly, whispers of a fight with another prisoner, whispers of justice that came faster than the courts could deliver. Maggie read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it away. She did not celebrate, did not dance, did not feel the rush of triumph she had expected. She just felt tired. Tired but free. The monster was gone, and she could finally start living again. Spring came to Kansas like a blessing. The snow melted, the rivers ran high, Wildflowers spread across the prairie in waves of yellow and purple and white. Maggie stood on the porch of her farmhouse and watched the sun rise over the land that Thomas had left her, the land she had fought to keep, the land that was finally, truly hers. A lot had changed since that terrible day at the cottonwood tree. The barn had been rebuilt, bigger and stronger than before. The whole town had come out to help raise the walls. Mrs. Callahan had brought moss. Mrs. Henderson had brought lemonade. Even Sheriff Miller had shown up with a hammer in his hand and sawdust on his boots. It had taken 2 days to finish. 2 days of hard work and laughter and the kind of community that Maggie had forgotten existed. She was not alone anymore. She knew that now. She had never really been alone. She just had not known where to look. The door opened behind her. Caleb stepped out onto the porch. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. Steam rose from them in the cool morning air. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Maggie replied. He handed her a cup. Their fingers touched briefly. A small thing, but it made her heart skip. So much had changed between them two. In the months since Wade's death, something had grown. Slowly, carefully, like a flower pushing through rocky soil. At first it was just friendship. 2 people who had been through hell together and come out the other side. They talked. They worked side by side. They shared meals and stories in the quiet companionship of long evenings on the porch. But somewhere along the way, friendship had turned to something more. Maggie had not expected to love again. After Thomas died, she had closed that door forever, locked it tight, thrown away the key. But Caleb had found another way in. Not by force, not by pressure, just by being there. Day after day, kind and steady and patient. He had never asked for anything, never expected anything, never tried to take more than she was willing to give. And that was exactly why she wanted to give him everything. She set down her coffee cup, turned to face him. "I have been thinking," she said. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerous," Maggie laughed. A real laugh, the kind she had almost forgotten how to make. "I have been thinking about the future," she said, "about what comes next, about what I want." She took a deep breath. "I want you," she said, "if you will have me." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. His face was unreadable. Then he smiled, a rare smile, the kind that transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. "I thought you would never ask," he said. The wedding was small, just a handful of guests. Mrs. Callahan, Mrs. Henderson, Amos Reed, Tom Sullivan, a few others who had stood by them when it mattered. They stood under the cottonwood tree, the same tree where Caleb had found Maggie hanging all those months ago. It seemed fitting somehow, to turn a place of pain into a place of joy. The preacher read the vows. Maggie said, "I do." Caleb said, "I do." And just like that, they were married. Afterward, they walked back to the house together, hand in hand, husband and wife. "Mrs. Hart," Caleb said. "It sounds good." "It does," Maggie agreed. "It really does." That night, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The same stars that had watched over this land for millions of years, that would watch over it for millions more. "I never thought I would have this again," Caleb said. "A family, someone to come home to, someone to build a life with." Maggie leaned her head against his shoulder. "Neither did I," she said. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over forever." She looked up at him. "But I was wrong. Life has a way of surprising you, of giving you things you never expected, things you never knew you needed." Caleb put his arm around her. "You are the bravest person I have ever known," he said. "What you went through, what you survived, what you fought for." He shook his head. "I am the lucky one," he said, "to have found you, to have you in my life." Maggie smiled. "We are both lucky," she said. "We found each other." They sat together in silence as the moon rose over the Kansas plain. The night was quiet, peaceful, full of promise. Somewhere out there, a coyote howled, an owl called, the wind whispered secrets through the tall grass. And Maggie thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The pain, the fear, the shame, but also the courage, the hope, the love. She had lost so much, but she had gained something she never expected. A second chance, a new beginning, a home. She closed her eyes and listened to Caleb's heartbeat, steady and strong, the heartbeat of a good man, the heartbeat of her husband. And she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, the way it was always meant to be.